Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for having us. You're going to meet several folks who, much like your all's day-to-day job is talking horses and tracks, all we talk is turf, and that's our world. And Dr. Munshaw is going to chime in as he sees fit because he will be a little more involved specifically in the program later on today. But look at our contact information here. All of the turfies on today's presentation would love to hear from you and learn from what you're doing, because just listening to Jamie talk there intrigues me about the climate that he's dealing with there in Louisville, because that's the climate I have even in the mountains of Southwest Virginia, and hearing about Colonial and the grasses they've had there. I'm going to talk to you today about cool season turf grasses from the perspective of how to choose them, what they bring to the table and what they don't. And Gregg knows to chime in when he sees fit. And we're looking at grasses that optimal top growth is in the range of about 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So for those of you still in the world of, or we're the ones not coming into that world, but 16 to 24 Celsius is when these grasses are expressing themselves with the most foliage to be removed. Their root growth is occurring primarily at temperatures of 40 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 to 16 C. They have little to no winter dormancy, but of course that depends on where your climate is, and it depends on the grasses, because in our world in Virginia, still most Kentucky bluegrasses and even most of our turf type tall fescues, which will be two of the big three that I'll talk today, they do pretty much lose their color if you think of that as being the definition of dormancy. And you see in this picture here from a cemetery that I took over in Virginia Beach many years ago, that is an overseeded Bermuda grass gravesite there in March, which is looking quite nice. And of course, the warm season grass is just starting to think about waking up in this image. So that's kind of what you get from a ryegrass overseeding. And Jamie was talking about how they're going to use that in that Bermuda grass base. These grasses, for all intents and purposes, maintain a pretty continuously active root system. They certainly aren't doing a lot during the coldest times of the year, but essentially they don't slough off their root system as many of our warm season grasses do annually. And of course, there's a great deal of variation in their heat and their drought persistence, depending on where you're located. And there's three of them that we're going to talk quite a bit about today. And there would be other options out there, but I think these three would cover by far the majority of possible uses in trafficked equine surfaces. So it'd be tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, and perennial ryegrass getting the majority of the use. And of that group, in terms of traditional winter overseeding and warm season grasses, the majority would be in perennial ryegrass, and Dr. Munshaw is going to give us some more information on that, as well as the potential for using Kentucky bluegrass. And as Jamie said, the world of turf continues to evolve, because things that were done when I heard him talk about K31 at midnight back in the mid 80s makes perfect sense back in the mid 80s, but we definitely wouldn't go that route in this day and age because of improvements in the genetics. So I use this slide for almost any training that I give to any group in terms of getting you to think about what's going on. My rule of thumb is, when I'm talking to people that have no understanding about turf grasses, is it's growing when it needs mowing. And when you're trying to make decisions about management practices, fertility, cultivation, et cetera, things that you should be doing, keep it that simple, because even, of course, drought will impact that and should change your decisions about what you're doing with these grasses. This is how I diagram seasonal growth patterns in the northern hemisphere. This is how I look at Virginia. So a transition zone state, which has cold winters and hot summers. And this is what cool season grasses do for us. And depending on where you are in the world in the cool season thing, this calendar would be adjusted. But for us, we're going through the winter in terms of it's not a lot happening, but we get a very early season, unbeknownst to most, surge in root growth, which for us in Virginia happens in February, March, and that's a great thing. And then when the temperatures arrive for summer heat, late spring, early summer, we'll see that push in shoot greening and shoot growth. You start cutting grass and root systems plummet, as well as stored foods. That's what carbohydrates are down here. We'll soon be entering here, now that we're in June in Virginia, we're already seeing reductions in our shoot growth rates because as the temperatures are now consistently in the 80s and upper 60s, these grasses are well outside that window of 60 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're going to plummet. And now we're trying to keep them alive. We get into the middle of summer into early fall. And then once we change seasons again, here comes the rebound. And notice all three, shoots, roots, and stored food, increase during the late summer to mid fall window. And I call that the primary management window. That's when you do the majority of your fertility, your cultural practices. If you can, you do it during that time of year because there still is shoot growth. There's definitely a rebound in root growth. And there certainly is the opportunity to put more stored food reserves away in your system. So primary there, secondary window, you've got some things you can do in the spring, but you got to be careful because you know what follows spring, and that's going to be the heat. Greg, anything to add based on this, your experiences?
No, I agree completely, Mike, that fall is so important. And you think about like aerification, when you're beating up the plants and stressing them out so much, if you're doing that in the spring, you're following it, like you said, by a tough season. And so you've got a stress in the spring with that aerification followed by that stress of the summer. And if the timing's not quite right, or if you get a early summer, hotter than normal summer, you can have some significant stress. And usually stress results in other bad things like disease pressure. So yeah, I agree completely that fall timing is so important on our cool season grasses.
And for those of you all, again, you're managing working around meet schedules. Since we understand nothing fits this. This is ideal world. And sometimes you have to do things outside the ideal world. Matter of fact, most of the time. But think about, there would be cultural management strategies in terms of things, some tools you could use in aeration that maybe would not be as extreme as going out there and punching and pulling and tearing. And you've got to choose that type of machinery, that type of technology appropriately for what this grass plant is going through, because this is what the plant is responding to. This is pretty much out of your control. So those will be things we'll be talking about. So the grasses, here's tall fescue. And tall fescues have probably had the biggest change between those grasses and Bermuda grass, which we'll hear about quite a bit more today. Those grasses have seen some of the biggest advancements in genetic improvements. So you see they've got a new scientific name, previously Festuca rundinacea. You see the new name there. Most of you have had turf classes or any type of forage or turf classes in the past probably recognize that older name, but we're looking at a plant that has definitely seen significant improvements in the last 20, 25 years. And with the arrival of what were termed turf type tall fescues pulled us away from that Kentucky 31, those forage type grasses, which still receive significant use in the world of turf, but not necessarily because they're recommended. So these grasses are basically bunch type cultivars. And one of the biggest changes is how well they now match up in terms of texture with Kentucky bluegrasses, because back in the day where Jamie was talking about K31 at midnight, that was the earliest generations of turf types coming on there in the mid to late 80s. And that was the first opportunity that we had to introduce these two grasses together, because without that, what you would see is in this top picture, you get a clump grass forming in a finer textured grass. And this was something we're trying to stay away from, especially for sporting activities, because that is a footing issue, much less it looks bad. So
and a lime green grass in a dark green grass.
Dark green grass, yes. And so it stands out like a sore thumb. And when you talk to people about quality turf, I appreciate that Jamie said safety, because in my world, working a lot with athletic field managers, that's my number one priority. That's going to be yours as well. Okay. But the color, the uniformity, a lack thereof, is what people interpret immediately as that's good or bad turf. And fescues definitely jumped out in a dark green bluegrass. But keep in mind, this is essentially a bunch type grass, which means it only develops tillers, daughter plants, stems that are right on top of the previously produced stem. The breeders continually to work for improvements, and we now have creeping rhizomatous below ground stem grasses. Greg, kind of what's going on in that world? Is that somewhere we're getting there? It's still yet to come?
It's getting better. I wouldn't say any of the marketing that you're seeing on these spreading fescues, take everything with a grain of salt. It's coming, it's getting better, but it's not like a Kentucky bluegrass I'd say anytime soon with really big, vigorous rhizomes.
They're coming though. The breeders are definitely working
Yeah.
on this, and that's part of their selection criteria. This grass is very stiff bladed, very upright growing. And you see that bottom picture, it requires a very sharp mower blade. Any grass needs to be cut with a sharp blade, but this is one in which if it gets clipped with a dull blade, it's going to turn brown. It's going to look terrible. It also reduces the health of that plant. And it would have what I would term the highest recommended mowing height of these cool season grasses. Not likely a factor that's going to affect you for most of your equine uses because they're going to be mowed quite taller than managed traditional home lawn, athletic field, golf turf would be. But this is a grass that is not one to be shaved down to an inch or less than an inch in terms of cutting height. But even that is being challenged now with the release of new varieties. So a little bit more about its description, adaptation, and use. In terms of soil conditions, tall fescues are probably one of the best adapted to a wide range of them. So you name it, wet, dry, acid, alkaline. If it's not extreme, it typically does pretty well. It hangs in there in the heat and the drought because of what we term drought avoidance. It has a very deep root system compared to the other grasses, so it's able to extract water from deeper in the soil profile. Moderate to poor cold tolerance, but again, over the last couple of decades, this continues to change. When I was coming through grad school back in the mid 80s, it was unheard of to be growing fescues pretty much anywhere in the northeastern or upper Midwestern United States. And now these things are regularly, or at least expanding in their use potential there.
And they're being recommended by northern universities.
Yeah, and that was not the case prior. So these grasses have excellent spring greening characteristics. So they're going to give you a jump in the spring. And you've got lots of choices out there. Sod producers that might sell you something that's called tall fescue sod do ask questions, because many times here in Virginia, when people tell me they're selling tall fescue, what they're actually selling you is something that's either 90-10 or 85-15% by weight of mixtures with Kentucky bluegrass. And also another very common sense thing to request when you're talking about sod and purchases, that this would not work in your world, is much of the sod is netted, because that's the quickest product that a sod producer can move to market. And of course, that's not going to fit well with an equine surface. But do ask questions about this. And there's nothing at all wrong with that bluegrass being in there. It's very common these days. It brings the advantages of bluegrass to the table. But again, it's something that you probably want to know in terms of a question to ask. And then the cultural intensity. This is not one of the highest intensively managed grass. So I think of it as low to medium maintenance intensity, but still delivering an aesthetically pleasing and quite potentially a good surface for equine surfaces. And it gets somewhere around 1/2 to a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, 24 to 48 kilograms of N per hectare. And notice that I've highlighted active growing month. Okay, again, when grass is growing, it needs mowing. So you would not be using this type of program in the dead of heat, okay, at your site, because it would respond, but it definitely wouldn't respond in a very positive way being on that program for too long. You're going to be producing a lot of shoots strictly at the expense of your root system. Your turf type tall fescue cultivars do respond to higher maintenance levels of nutrition. Your particular problems, brown patch and gray leaf spot, are the two diseases which, under more intensively managed and especially mismanaged nitrogen fertilizer or irrigation, can become really serious problems that might warrant that you would make some type of a fungicide application somewhere in that program. And these grasses, since they don't produce lateral stems to speak of, they have very little to no thatching tendency. Greg, any last things to add about tall fescue before I move on to bluegrass?
Just on brown patch, usually we see more brown patch pressure with taller heights of cut, and so that's obviously something that we're going to see on racetracks, and so it'd be something to look out for if you're growing tall fescue.
And that's what you're seeing in that picture there on the screen. That is a brown patch infestation, and most of the time the grass will recuperate. But of course, that certainly doesn't look good. And if it is reaching the point where you're losing grass, then you need to address that prior to losing the grass. Okay, next is Kentucky bluegrass. And this image is showing one of the strengths of bluegrass, and that is this stem. This is a rhizome, okay, and you see small ones. This one's quite large. Okay, this plant, much finer textured than the majority of our tall fescues, but again, they now are matching up quite well. But the reason people would use bluegrass for most sporting event type of activities where it's adapted would be to take advantage of the recuperative potential that we see with that stem. So its description, adaptation, and use. Find a medium textured, very prominently folded. That's an identification feature. It's got a really strong, prominent midvein, okay? It has relatively short rhizomes. You see there 3, 4, 5 inches typically is, you know, what we'll find here in Virginia, but it still is an aggressive creeper. And again, good or bad, the good part is that means it has a lot of recuperative potential. The bad part is stems are the primary contributor to thatch. So this is a grassing system that's going to develop this layer of non-decomposed stems, which accumulates just at the surface of your soil and in that turf grass canopy. This will happen over time, especially the more aggressively that you manage that turf. And that picture you're seeing on the bottom is a nice 3/4, 1/2 inch thatch layer. And a little bit of thatch is actually quite desirable for bringing traffic to this system. Its cold hardiness as a species, exceptional. These grasses tend to go dormant during extreme summer environmental stress. So they essentially shut down and go into survival mode. And that's how they deal with that stress period. They're slower to come out of the spring, but again, this is somewhat dependent now on the cultivar, the variety, because we're seeing huge advances in spring greening of grasses that are just coming onto the market. Okay. And it responds to aggressive management. This one, more so than tall fescue, really does. It almost needs those types of programs. It needs supplemental irrigation. It has more insect pressure from things such as the white grub, typically even from things like fall armyworm, things along that line. And its disease, primary disease of importance here where I live in Virginia, is one called summer patch, which actually infects in mid to late spring. But since it attacks the root system, the damage shows up a little bit later on. So many times you don't know this has happened, and then it occurs, and that's not good. Many people will go ahead and treat preventatively to ensure this does not occur if they have a history. This is a slower to germinate grass than the others, but again, it offers such good recuperative potential that makes it a very prominent grass for this use. Lots and lots of seed sources available. Blends of Kentucky bluegrass that were seeded in terms of sod are available in areas of adaptation. And again, remember that it is mixed with turf type tall fescue in more transition zones / warmer climates. Okay, Greg, I'm going to pause and see anything that you can add regarding Kentucky bluegrass, because you'll be talking a little bit more about that.
Yeah, just an excellent all-around grass for the northern climate. And the grass that you're going to see on all sporting surfaces in the north, including woodbine in Ontario. And the breeders are working on this one intensively as well, where they're putting some more heat tolerance into it. So we're seeing it in more southern locations, even as far down as Atlanta.
Yeah, and it's certainly performing well in those areas. So as Greg says, again, the breeders watch, the pendulum swings back and forth, and now we're seeing more cool season grasses easing back down into the southern climates where 10, 15 years ago, it was warm season grasses migrating north. So again, keep up with what's going on out there. You'll see some changes. The last of the big three, perennial ryegrass. This picture is showing it in its clump habit, its growth habit. This is not a creeper, but again, in that second bullet there, breeders are working on creeping cultivars. So much like you're seeing in the world of tall fescues, there are going to continue to be advances made with these grasses, that they're going to have lateral stems. This grass's texture is such that it mixes very well with bluegrasses. And this has been a staple in northern climate athletic fields forever. And the reason for that one is it'll be coming up here shortly, but the biggest reason that we used to use a lot of this grass is how rapidly it germinates from seed. This is not a grass that is noted for extremes in environment. So if it's super hot, super cold, very dry, again, breeders continue to make improvements. These things are seen in our field trials when they go through these types of periods, but this is a grass that probably has the most stress concerns from either pest or environment out of these big three that we talked about today. Its maintenance requirements is much like bluegrass. It's a higher input grass in about the half pound to 1 pound of N per thousand per active growing month. And it does require supplemental irrigation to keep it going. Lots and lots of seed sources are available. It is a very limited offering grass in terms of sod production. So there's the comment about the germination rate. It's the most rapid seed germination of our major grasses. Again, improvements in all of these species have occurred, but forever, that's been one of the biggest reasons to choose perennial ryegrass is how fast it comes up. And as a mature plant, it actually has very strong, excellent wear tolerance. As an immature, any of them are going to not hold up to the wear and tear of heavy traffic, especially from an equine situation. But as a mature plant, this one has excellent wear tolerance. It has been our standard for winter overseeding of Bermuda grass for many years. And its mowing quality, it's always going to be noted for its striping effect, very high quality visually speaking. Greg, what can you add about perennial ryegrass for me?
So it's kind of the grass that I love to hate. It's a beautiful grass, and like Dr. Goatley just said, it stripes up really pretty when it's mature. But it tends to get just beat up by anything and everything. And so if you get it under any sort of heat stress whatsoever or cold stress up in the north, it's not going to do well. But it hides a lot of sins. And because of that quick germination, you can fill in some spots really quickly with this grass, but you may be paying for those consequences of putting it in later on.
I agree. This is a chart, and we'll have this information available for you, whether we provide it to Mick and Karen. But again, I'll put this PDF up there, but this would be something you can refer to compare these three grasses, because every system is going to have strengths and weaknesses. You're going to learn today, of course, there's no perfect, even if you're in a strictly cool season zone or strictly warm season zone. There's going to probably be a better, but there's not an absolute winner. These are comparisons side by side about pros and cons. And every single one of these grasses has some advantage to it. And this day and age, we're now seeing these combinations of previously, these combinations were really outside of bluegrass, ryegrass weren't encouraged. But these days, bluegrass tall fescue as sod is one of the major ones. And for me in my world, working with sports field managers, if they don't have a large budget, I'm a tall fescue Kentucky bluegrass cool season sports turf recommendation kind of guy. So every grass, strengths, weaknesses, use tables like this to help you make decisions, because there's not going to be one slam dunk, but there are going to be better choices. So you're thinking about the grass, everything we'll be talking about today, your climate, your season of use, and the intensity of use when that's occurring, then the soil characteristics, which Jamie talked about, and certainly that plays a large role in drainage, how fast does water move through, et cetera. Then real world, what's the maintenance budget and the equipment that you have available for a grass that you choose? Because I get into situations where I'm a huge proponent of Bermuda grass. And if somebody tells me we don't have the equipment or the ability to keep Bermuda grass mowed satisfactorily when it's growing, then I'm like, that might be the worst grass you could possibly choose for that situation. You think about all those things, write these down, pros, cons, et cetera. Then you start refining your selection for what you think is, first of all, the best species. Then from that, put together, what are the best blends, the same species mixed together, or the best mixtures, different species mixed together, and review research data from sources like USDA's National Turf Evaluation Program, individual universities, other institutes doing traffic tolerance trials out there, because this type of information is available. Keep in mind that improvements in plant genetics are always being made. I told you that pendulum swings back and forth, cool season and warm season. And we're going to have more specifics on management strategies for cool season grasses a little bit later on in Mike Bookholder's separate presentation. Greg, what else would you like to say to clean this part up for me?
Okay, I need to make a comment, and then I have a question. And so the comment is, because of the pandemic, everybody was at home last year. Everybody was working on their lawns. There is a global grass seed shortage. And so if you need grass seed for this fall, you need to talk to your seed supplier now to get it secured. or else you're going to be out of luck come this fall. It's that tight. The second thing is, Mike, you didn't mention fine fescue. What are your thoughts on fine fescue on racing surfaces?
Well, for right now, I couldn't find anything, Greg, in the literature to say. I'll never say never to what could be used, but in terms of finding situations where I could point to in which fine fescues, and there's a host of this group of different grasses that we classify as fine fescues. In general, I don't think it has the wear tolerance that we're looking for. Even as a mature grass, when I talk about it as a turf, even for homeowners, I'm like, be wary if you have kids or pets, because fescues, fine fescues, just don't hold up to that type of traffic. I do see it used a little in golf turf in the UP of Michigan, et cetera. But again, different type of use. I guess I would say I'm leery of that because I can't find information. I can't find enough to make me say, oh, I think that's one of the group that I should have included, Greg. That's why I basically bypassed it. But I'm sure, because it's happened many times before, I'm sure I can be and will be proven wrong. But right now, I'm leery of it. Your thought?
Yeah. No, I agree. I haven't seen it stand up to traffic well enough to add something to an equine surface.
So our last slide, I'm going to share or return the sharing back to my colleagues, but there's our contact information. Please let Dr. Munshaw or myself know, and we'll have a chance to take your questions a little bit later on today's program.
This is Karen, and this is her land. She's been here a long time, along with Mojo. The first fence post went up here. Now there's 5,000 of them. After the storm, she started the cleanup here. And when she needs some peace and quiet, she always finds it right here. This is more than just land, it's home. Karen runs with us on a John Deere 3E Series tractor, because who says a day's work has to take all day? Nothing runs like a Deere. Search John Deere 3E Series for more.
Being a teenager and in high school and middle school is not easy for girls these days. And they get to come here, spend time working around the farm, spend time with the animals, and not feel that pressure until we go to horse shows. The first time I saw this land, I was about 12 years old. I came here with an old mentor. I fell in love with it as a little girl, and I said I was gonna own it one day. My mother, when I was 4 years old, put me on a little pony walking around the zoo. That was it for me. Love at first sight. Like any kid, when I was younger, I wanted to compete more in the Olympics and go Grand Prix and do things like that. But I put that all on the side and realized I had a different agenda in life. I've taught about 800 kids in this area. A typical day starts early in the morning with feeding the horses. Then usually we clean stalls. This is a daily chore, sometimes twice a day. I'm always on the tractor, mowing, spreading things around, you name it. This is a John Deere 3025P. I love my tractor. I couldn't live without it. I like to just relax and be left alone. I call it my husband. He's very reliable, and it doesn't argue. It's so easy to use. My 68-year-old mother has never driven anything like this before, and she was scared to death of it. And once she did, she loves it. She drives it all the time for me and helps me out around the farm. Being here in Florida, we deal with a lot of hurricanes, so it can be very stressful when we're in the path of one. That John Deere helps me so much. We go around picking up debris, moving, pushing things with the bucket. I always have an average of 50 students, so whenever there's a disaster that comes around, they're always here and they're ready to work. I call all my girls my kids. They're like part of my family, and they get scholarships for riding, and so we try to keep our sport here a little bit serious but fun. We go to the horse shows. It's great for them. Good, very nice. Teaches them a lot of sportsmanship, how to be more in charge and have more self-confidence. A little stronger on that. There. The parents tell me all the time, you are such a huge influence in our child's life. I love to share my experience with these girls and be able to steer them in a better path. Everybody always asks me, how do you keep doing this? I say, just the sheer passion of it. What am I gonna do? Get a condo on the beach somewhere? I'm happier here. I'm Karen Neese, and this is my land.